Miss Marple and the Girl Who Whispered. At Dawn, Chapter 1, The Murmur Among Rose Bushes. It was a particularly serene morning in the village of Little Davington, where the neatly trimmed hedges and seasonal flowers seemed as attentive to decorum as its inhabitants. The breeze carried with it the sweet scent of honeysuckle and rhubarb tart, and the murmur of the first bees mingled with the soft sounds of teacups placed on china saucers. At the Everstone residence, a family of somewhat diminished lineage, their traditional wedding was being held, spring breakfast in the gardens. Mrs. Lavinia Everstone, always concerned with appearances, had laid out tables with immaculate white tablecloths and trays of still steaming scones. Among the guests were all the village notables, the vicar, Dr. Fielding, the young new teacher, and sitting discreetly in a shady corner, Miss Marple. A very well-organised event, Miss Marple murmured, sipping her tea. Although, I should say, Mrs. Everstone has hired some new staff. That maid doesn't seem to know how to cut scones properly. Who? That girl? Said Mrs. Vinter, Jane Marple's neighbour and occasional confidant. Her name is Eliza. They say she arrived a few weeks ago, quiet as a grave, but with eyes that seem to have seen too much. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, watching the young woman. Eliza was nothing more than a shadow among the flowers, moving with a mixture of precision and reluctance. She paused briefly at the tables without looking at the guests. Sometimes she seemed to be talking to herself, barely a whisper that no one could quite hear. Some of the ladies present had already noticed her behaviour, and discreet whispers began to circulate between sips of tea. The light atmosphere was broken almost imperceptibly when, around 11 o'clock, a scream was heard. A sudden sharp scream that cut through the air with violence. Everyone turned toward the end of the garden, where Eliza had disappeared among the rose bushes. Dr. Fielding was the first to run, followed by the gardener, and more slowly by the rest of the guests, who were now forming a restless murmur. It was the gardener who found her. Mrs. Lavinia Everstone lay on the grass, her wide-brimmed hat still on her head, an expression of utter shock on her face. A blood-stain spread from her side, seeping into her cream-coloured linen blouse. A kitchen knife protruded from his abdomen, and beside her, motionless standing, with her gaze empty and her mouth still moving in a voiceless murmur, was Eliza. "No, I didn't mean to," he stammered. "I just came for the whisper." Silence fell over the garden. "Someone call the police!" Dr. Fielding exclaimed, kneeling beside the body. "She's dead." Miss Marple didn't move immediately. She watched the scene with a calmness that would have seemed insensitive, were it not for the serene twinkle in her eyes, accustomed to distinguishing the important from the theatrical. It wasn't the knife that caught his attention the most. It was the fact that Eliza didn't have any blood on her hands, and that Lavinia's hat wasn't even slightly crooked, despite the fall. "Funny," Jane Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Very funny." The scandal had begun, and with it a mystery that could only flourish among the manicured rose bushes of Little Davington. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Bakery. The commotion soon spread through the narrow streets of Little Davington. By the time Mrs. Lavinia Everstone's body was transported by county constables, with the strictness of forensic protocol and the discreet efficiency reserved for the wealthy, the news had already become legend. and as in every good English village, the first stop for the scandal was the bakery. "Stabbed!" exclaimed Mrs. Bramble, the owner of the establishment, flour on her knuckles. "In your own garden and in broad daylight? That's not like little Davington. Not since the case of Colonel Harper's chickens." "This has nothing to do with chickens," Mr. Simmons, the postman, replied sternly as he selected his rye bread. "This is murder. And with a kitchen knife, did you know? From the new game, they say, the one Mrs. Everstone bought in Bath." "That girl, the new maid?" asked Mrs. Dodd, wearing her eternal straw hat. "I always knew. You can't trust someone who doesn't say hello on the street. But she was the one who screamed," Nancy Pickering, a young seamstress, timidly pointed out. "I didn't see any blood on her hands, just that way she looked, like she was hearing something the rest of us couldn't." All eyes turned toward her, a mixture of distrust and fear. The rumours soon became certainties, and the certainties became condemnations. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, sitting in the corner of the bakery with a slice of almond cake and steaming tea, was knitting. She didn't tend to talk much in those spaces. She knew that the truth wasn't imposed, it was revealed, and often she knitted better than she told it. "It never ceases to amaze me how a single death can resurrect so many trials," she commented in an almost casual tone, without looking up from her knitting. "Pardon, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Bramble asked, coming closer. "Oh, nothing important," he replied with a smile. "I was just thinking about how people are always more interested in who might have done it than why someone would do it. And that, he thought, was the difference between gossip and the truth." Outside the day was still beautiful, which somewhat offended the collective mourning. Neighbours spoke in low voices as they passed each other in the square. No one trusted anyone. The local police, bewildered, kept Eliza under guard in the rectory, awaiting the arrival of the regional inspector. No one seemed very interested in questioning her. Her guilt was already an accepted fact. However, not everyone accepted this narrative so easily. Miss Marple visited the rectory that afternoon. Reverend Mullins, a pious and trembling man, reluctantly allowed her entry. "She's strange, Miss Marple. She says things that don't make sense. She refuses to eat, and sometimes she talks to herself. I confess, she scares me a little." The young woman was sitting by the office window, the golden rays of the sunset illuminating her pale face. She didn't look up when Miss Marple entered, but she murmured something. "Dawn again." "What are you saying, dear?" Jane asked softly, moving closer. "I heard her, I swear. She spoke to me among the flowers. She told me she would come, that she would come at dawn." Her words were soft, brittle, as if each one weighed more than her voice could carry. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was fear on her face, yes, but also something else, something harder to read. It wasn't the expression of a murderer. It was the expression of someone trapped in a nightmare that wasn't yet over. Jane turned thoughtfully to the Reverend. "I'd like to ask a few questions," he said calmly. "Not to the young lady, not now. To you." "Me?" "Yes, about the Everstones, and about what's been happening lately in this town. Because, Reverend, sometimes flowers aren't the only thing that blooms with spring." The man swallowed, and outside the sky was beginning to darken. Chapter 3. Conversation Threads. The next morning brought overcast weather, as if the heavens had finally learned of what had happened at Everston Gardens. The rain hadn't yet fallen, but the air was thick with silence, broken only by the crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path to the rectory, her hat sitting snugly against her chest, her handbag hanging with pinpoint accuracy from her forearm. In her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, though they still didn't quite fit together. There was something off, something about the stillness with which Eliza had stood beside the body, something about the way Lavinia Everstone had fallen, orderly, almost staged, too neat, too precise. Upon arrival, she was greeted this time by Mrs. Mullins, a tall woman with stiffly coiled hair, who seemed born to manage awkward silences and trays of tea. "My husband isn't in, Miss Marple," she said without emotion. "He's at church, preparing his sermon, but you can come in if you wish." "Thank you, dear. I just need a few minutes." The office was dim. Eliza was no longer there. In her place, an unopened envelope lay on the Reverend's desk. Miss Marple didn't touch it, but she looked at it carefully. It was addressed to Lavinia Everstone. It wasn't recent. The stamp indicated a date almost 2 weeks earlier. "Curious, do you know when that letter arrived?" he asked as he returned. To the hallway, Mrs. Mullins narrowed her eyes. "It was delivered here by mistake a few days ago. The postman said someone had changed the addresses on their list. We were going to return it to Mrs. Everstone, but, well, you know. And you didn't think of opening it?" The woman looked horrified. "Of course not. Other people's correspondence is sacred." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Of course it is." He left the rectory without further comment, but the contents of the letter now danced in his mind like a distant melody. A stray letter. A young woman who spoke in whispers. A carefully arranged death. The next stop was the flower shop, not because she expected to find answers there, but because Maisie Holland, an observant and somewhat gossipy young woman who had served as Mrs. Everstone's companion until a few months ago, worked there. Maisie was one of the few who had known Lavinia in her less public moments, and also one of the few who didn't mourn her death with crocodile tears. "Would you like flowers for a service, Miss Marple?" Maisie asked neutrally, arranging a bouquet of lilies. "Oh, no, dear. I've come for something less ephemeral than flowers. A little conversation." "About Mrs. Everstone?" Miss Marple nodded delicately. Maisie was silent for a few seconds, and then, like someone deciding to uncork a bottle, she spoke. "She wasn't a bad woman, but she wasn't a good one either. She was strict, controlling. She loved order more than people, and she didn't like change. That's why she fired the previous cook without warning, and that's why she hired Eliza. She wanted someone who wouldn't ask questions. And do you know anything about Eliza's previous life? Very little. She said she'd been in London, that she needed a quiet place. She didn't talk much, but once I heard her talking in her sleep. She said the same name over and over again, Judith, as if he were looking for her. Miss Marple kept that name in her mind like an unknown key, carefully, knowing that sooner or later it will reveal a door. Before leaving, he stopped in front of the bouquet Maisie had prepared. Lilies. A curious choice for someone like Lavinia, don't you think? It was her favourite flower, although she never said why. As she walked back to her house, Miss Marple remembered another minor detail: the untouched teacup on the tray they'd found next to the body, and the sugar bowl still full. Lavinia never drank tea without sugar. There you are. Still, details. Always the details. Upon arriving home, he turned on the hall lamp and took out his notebook. In his neat handwriting, he wrote 3 names: Eliza Judith, a letter gone astray, and below, a question: who really benefits from Lavinia Everstone's death? Dawn had brought a crime, but the mystery was just beginning to blossom. Chapter 4. Faces Among the Rose Bushes. The arrival of Detective Inspector Cedric Hanley, a man with a precise manner and an impeccable moustache, slightly shook the town's already shaky composure. He came from Westbridge with a reputation for efficiency and few words, and brought with him a notepad, a pocket magnifying glass, and an annoying predisposition to closing cases quickly. Everything indicates the young Mead did it, he told the vicar, after a cursory review of the facts. She was there, she had access to the weapon, and she has no alibi. We don't need any more. Miss Marple, who was discreetly knitting a few feet away, didn't even flinch at this hasty conclusion. In her experience, real murderers were rarely so conveniently situated. That same afternoon, the inspector gathered those present at Everston House, where the drawing-room, once used for receiving formal visitors, had become the scene of a provincial inquisition. Lavinia's portrait still hung on the wall, and she seemed to observe the scene with her usual expression of disapproval. "We'll start with Mr. Nathaniel Everston," the inspector announced, the deceased's only son. Nathaniel was a man in his 40s, with a receding hairline and an ill-disguised disdain for the town. He dressed with unnecessary formality and settled onto the sofa with a mixture of annoyance and superiority. "Inspector," he said in a flat voice, "my mother and I weren't particularly close. Since my father died, she's become more rigid, but I assure you I had no reason to hurt you." "However," Hanley chimed in, "you have debts, considerable ones according to your banker. Were you aware that your mother had recently updated her will?" Nathaniel frowned. No. Had he done it? Indeed. He left the house and most of his fortune to a charitable foundation. You would receive only a monthly pension. A murmur ran through the room. Nathaniel leaned forward, visibly upset. "That's absurd. It's my inheritance." Miss Marple said nothing, but she made a mental note of something very simple. The surprise in the man's voice was genuine. If he had killed his mother, it hadn't been because of the will, at least not because of the contents she now knew. The next to be questioned was Miss Clara Finch, Lavinia's old friend and frequent companion at social events. She was an elderly, slender woman with a voice as sharp as her opinions. "Lavinia was peculiar," she said, sipping her tea carefully, "and lately more paranoid than ever. She said someone was spying on her, that she saw shadows in the garden at dawn. I told her it was her age, or the brandy." "And where were you during breakfast?" Hanley asked. "Sitting next to Dr. Fielding. Ask her, if you'd like." The inspector made a note, but seemed sceptical. Clara didn't seem to have any obvious motive, except perhaps resentment at having been overshadowed by Mrs. Everston for decades, but social jealousy rarely led to murder. Or did it? Next up was the gardener, a robust young man named Peter Glanville. He had worked for the Everstones for 3 years, and unlike the others, he seemed genuinely saddened by his employer's death. She was strict, yes, but fair. She never treated me with disdain, like others in this town. Did you see anything suspicious that morning? Peter hesitated for a moment. I'm not sure. I saw Eliza walking near the hedge, talking to herself. But I also saw Mr. Nathaniel come out of the kitchen before the scream. I didn't mention it before because, well, I didn't want to cause trouble. The inspector's face hardened. Miss Marple merely raised an eyebrow, not at what had been said, but at what hadn't been said. The line between witness and suspect was increasingly blurred. As evening fell, with the sky tinged with a weary grey, Miss Marple returned home. The day had been productive. She had observed gestures, studied reactions, and now she had one more thread to pull. At his desk he unfolded his notebook again. He wrote, "Reasons. Nathaniel. Money, although I was unaware of the will. Clara. Social jealousy. Old resentments. Peter. Protection. Loyalty. Eliza. Victim. Witness. Anything else? Then, below, one more sentence. The flowers weren't for the deceased. They were for someone who is still alive." And with that, he closed the notebook. The crime still had no face, but the masks were beginning to crack. Chapter 5. Between Petals and Paper. The next morning, Miss Marple did what many in the village still didn't fully understand. She returned to the scene of the crime. Not with dramatic flair or theatrical intent, but with the leisurely gait of someone who knows that scenes speak, that objects remember, and that gardens, no matter how well tended, hold secrets beneath the disturbed earth. The Everstone garden wasn't cordoned off. Inspector Hanley had gone to Westbridge for the night, satisfied with his interrogations and certain that the culprit wouldn't flee into the vicar's custody. No one else seemed interested in returning to the spot where death had interrupted breakfast. But Miss Marple knew that places retain traces more subtle than a footprint. The morning breeze lightly stirred the rose bushes. The hedge where Eliza had been seen whispering to herself was still damp with dew. Jane bent down and picked something up from the ground, a broken petal, not from a rose bush, but from a lily flower. White lilies, like the ones Maisie had mentioned the day before. But here, among the rose bushes, there shouldn't be any lilies. The event's floral arrangement was at the other end of the garden. What was a lone lily doing among the rose bushes? He turned slowly, scanning his surroundings. A couple of steps away, barely visible in the grass, he saw a crumpled piece of paper. Picking it up, he noticed it was torn, as if it had been torn out in haste. It was nothing more than the corner of a letter with cramped writing in blue ink. Barely a single sentence was legible. "Don't tell Judith. She doesn't know what we did yet." Jane blinked. There was that name again, Judith. She carefully placed the fragment in her bag and stood up. A misplaced flower, a torn note, a connection, still tenuous, but enough to fuel the suspicion that the crime had deeper roots than a simple outburst. Later that day, he visited the parish library, not for books, but for conversation. He knew that Miss Eloise Frampton, a retired librarian and unofficial authority on local history, spent her afternoons there sorting through dusty documents and recounting old scandals with the delicacy of a secret keeper. "Judith, you say?" Eloise repeated thoughtfully. "It's a rare name around here. There aren't many Judiths in Little Davington. And in the past, anyone who's caused a stir? Well, there was a Judith Turner, about 15 years ago, a brilliant young woman, much beloved by Mrs. Everston, if I'm not mistaken. She lived in the cottage on the edge of town. Why do you ask? Curiosity, nothing more," said Miss Marple with her usual humility. "She disappeared suddenly," Eloise continued, as if she couldn't resist dusting off that part of her mental archive. "They said she was sent to London after a love disappointment. Others have said she was ill, but Lavinia never mentioned her again, as if she had ceased to exist. And do you know if he had any relationship with Eliza, the new girl? Not that I know of, but everyone's related in one way or another, don't you think?" He laughed more out of habit than joy. Miss Marple emerged with the certainty that Judith Turner wasn't a name thrown out at random by the ravings of a maid. She was a half-buried ghost, now threatening to resurface. At dusk, he discreetly visited the gardener, Peter Glanville. He found him in his small cottage next to the greenhouse, cleaning tools with an almost meditative devotion. "Miss Marple," he said when he saw her, "have you come to question me too?" "Oh, no, nothing that formal. I was just wondering if you could tell me more about Eliza. Did she ever mention Judith?" Peter hesitated. His fingers tightened on the cloth. "Once I heard her talking in her sleep. She said that Judith had to know the truth. Nothing more. It scared me a little, to be honest." "And did you ever see her with correspondence? Letters?" "Yes, of course. I received one every week. Always from the same sender. London, I think. She never opened them in front of anyone. Sometimes she seemed more nervous after reading them." Jane nodded. "And do you remember when you received the last one?" 3 days before breakfast. She put it in her apron, but I didn't find it in her room. A missing letter. A dead woman. And a name, Judith, repeated like a muffled echo. Upon returning home, Miss Marple reviewed everything she had learned that day. The clues weren't grand, nor were they bloody. They were small, like breadcrumbs left on purpose, or carelessly, but they followed a trail, a path that led to a secret much older than the crime itself, and perhaps to a motif buried in the disturbed earth of the rose bushes. Chapter 6. Shadows in Memory. The sky over Little Davington had become capricious. A thick fog began to cover the village like a sheet of uncertainty, making even the most familiar roads feel strange. Chimneys smoked early, footsteps grew quicker, and conversations shorter. But Miss Marple wasn't in a hurry. The fog, for her, was an old friend. It covered up the unnecessary and highlighted the essential, and that day she had decided it was time to ask questions no one wanted to answer. Her first visit was to Nathaniel Everston. Not to the mansion, but to the local pub, where the man had been taking refuge with increasing frequency since the murder. She found him alone, in front of a glass of whisky, his gaze lost in some indeterminate spot in the mirror behind the counter. "Mr. Everstone," he greeted in his friendly tone. "What a dull day, don't you think?" "Miss Marple," he replied without turning around. Have you come to analyze my gestures, or to share a drink? Maybe a little of both, she said, sitting next to him. Sometimes the truth comes out better in discreet sips. Nathaniel smiled humorlessly. Have you come to ask me if I killed my mother? Oh, no, I don't think she did it for money. You didn't know about the new will. I was wondering, rather, if there was something going on between your mother and a certain Judith Turner. The name fell like a stone into a still pool. Nathaniel slowly turned his head toward her, his eyes more focused than before. Who told you about Judith? Let's just say flowers speak louder than you expect. Did you know her? Nathaniel ran his hand over his face. I knew her, yes, and I loved her, if you must know. But my mother didn't approve. She said Judith was unsuitable, that she didn't belong in our class. She pressured her, isolated her, and in the end, Judith disappeared. Did he run away? I don't know. One day she just left. No note, no goodbye. My mother pretended nothing had happened, but I looked for her, for years. What if I told you that Judith might have returned? Not as before, but as a secret. Could she have had a child, perhaps? Nathaniel didn't respond immediately, but his hand trembled slightly as he took the glass. Are you suggesting that Eliza— Nothing that direct, dear. I'm just sharing theories. Some flowers grow from the same stem without anyone knowing it. Nathaniel stood without responding, but his expression had changed, as if a long-buried memory had begun to push the coffin lid open from within. Later, Miss Marple decided to confront a more elusive figure, Miss Clara Finch. He found her in her living room, surrounded by porcelain figures shaped like shepherds and hand-embroidered tapestries. The air smelled of lavender, camphor, and pent-up frustration. Jane, he said with a tight smile, strange to see you here. Would you like some tea? No, thank you, dear. I prefer the taste of silence when there are hidden truths. Clara raised an eyebrow. Are you coming to accuse me of something? Just to understand. You and Lavinia were friends, but also rivals. I wonder if Judith represented something to you. A threat, a thwarted opportunity. The porcelain in Clara's hands trembled. Judith was young, fresh. Lavinia adored her. I suppose I envied her. Everyone talked about her as if she were the embodiment of perfection. And then, suddenly, she disappeared. Lavinia never explained anything. As if she was ashamed. Shame? Why? Clara hesitated. There were rumors that Judith was pregnant, that the father wasn't who Lavinia had expected. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. And do you think those rumors had a basis? Gunnar sighed. We'll never know. But Lavinia began to change after that. She became more controlling, more fearful, as if she were afraid the past would come back to take its toll. Jane stood up. Thank you, Clara. Sometimes a confession doesn't need to be complete to be helpful. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked to the rectory once more. This time, not to see Eliza, but Reverend Mullins. She found him in the vegetable garden, pruning tomatoes with a concentration that bordered on the mystical. Reverend, do you remember the letter that arrived at your office by mistake, the one addressed to Mrs. Everston? Yes, of course. Did you ever read anything by her, even if it was by accident? Well, yes, just a few lines. It mentioned a reunion. Someone wanted to see her at dawn on Sunday. It said, "I'll be among the flowers, like before. Judith." Miss Marple nodded gravely. That wasn't a threat. It was a plea, and in his mind, the image of Eliza standing among the rose bushes, whispering into the air, took on a new meaning. Maybe she wasn't talking to herself. Maybe he was talking to a mother whom I had never met. Chapter 7. The Rose That Did Not Wither. The morning dawned without fog, but with a clarity that was almost cruel. Every shadow in Little Davington seemed sharper, every crack in the window pane more evident. The town, accustomed to covering its secrets with lace curtains and cordial smiles, suddenly felt naked. And as if fate obeyed the logic of twisted tales, a new surprise shook the delicate balance. The postman, Mr. Simmons, arrived agitated at the rectory mid-morning, demanding to see Reverend Mullins. In his hands he held a crumpled envelope, his expression panicked. "This letter, it appeared in my bag today, but it wasn't there yesterday. And look at the postmark," she said in a tremulous voice. Miss Marple, who had just finished a brief visit to deliver a forgotten handkerchief, crept up. The Reverend opened the envelope while Simmons trembled. The contents were brief. Yellowed paper, the ink shaky. Dawn came, but it didn't see me. Maybe it was better that way. Not all returns are worth celebrating. Don't look for me. I'm not the Judith you remember. There was no signature, just a dried petal stuck to the paper, as if someone had carefully placed it there. The Reverend paled. Simmons crossed himself. Miss Marple, for her part, only frowned slightly. This wasn't a confession. It was a farewell, and the fact that the letter had appeared after the murder, dated earlier, could only mean one thing. Someone had hidden it, and then deliberately reinserted it into the postal system, to divert, to confuse, or to cover up for someone. That same afternoon, Jane headed to the Everstone greenhouse. The location had been ignored by investigators. After all, it wasn't close to the crime scene. But Miss Marple was intrigued by one detail. The flowers in the garden, so well tended, weren't quite in season. And she knew, because no one could notice it better than a gardener her age, that white lilies didn't bloom naturally at that time of year. Not without help, not without growing them under glass. The greenhouse smelled damp and of living earth. Among shelves of pots and gardening tools, she found several boxes of bulbs labelled with dates. Some were empty, others were strangely mixed together. And there, under a wooden slab that served as a workbench, he found a small metal trunk covered with a tarp. He opened it. Inside were old papers, a child's scarf, and a picture frame with a faded photograph. It showed a dark-haired young woman hugging a little girl. Both were smiling. On the back, in pencil, barely legible, Judith and Eliza, Spring 1911. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. It wasn't a theory. Not anymore. Judith was Eliza's mother, and someone had done everything possible to hide it. The discovery couldn't be shared abruptly, not with the police yet, not with the town. Miss Marple knew that the truth without preparation was like poison. It could kill more than it could cure. So he made one more visit, to Peter Glanville, the gardener. He found him watering the edge of the hedge, looking distant. "Did you know there are lilies blooming in the greenhouse?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, I planted them. Mrs. Everstone asked me to last year. It was her favourite flower. And did you know why?" Peter shrugged. He said they reminded him of something. Or someone. He never explained further. Jane watched his face closely. "And what about Judith? Did you know who she really was?" Peter looked down. "Judith was my sister." The revelation came so naturally that the air seemed to fall silent. They sent her away out of shame. My mother worked as a maid here. Lavinia fired her when she discovered Judith's pregnancy. No one ever spoke of it again. I stayed. I wanted to help her when she returned, but Judith never came back. Only letters, one every few years. And Eliza? Peter swallowed. "I didn't know she was your daughter, until I saw her sleeping. She had that same frown. Then I found a letter. From Judith. It told me everything. She asked me to take care of her if she ever came." Jane nodded slowly. "Is that why you worked?" "Here, yes, to be close, to protect Eliza from Lavinia, if necessary." "And he did it?" Peter remained silent. "I couldn't prevent what happened, but I swear it wasn't me." "I know," Miss Marple replied. "You just buried secrets, but someone dug them up with a knife." Returning home, Miss Marple lit the lamp and wrote one last line in her notebook. "The truth is among those who knew Judith would return, and they feared what it might reveal." And then he underlined a name. One who had not yet been questioned. One that had always been close by, but never in the centre. Tomorrow, he thought, would be the day to let the truth bloom, and some flowers, when they open, smell of guilt. Chapter 8. The Silent Game. Dawn arrived with a suspicious calm, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple woke early, not out of habit, although she was a woman of habit, but because she knew the time for silent observation was over. It was no longer enough to tie up loose ends in private. Now was the time to place a piece on the table and see who would move it. She drank black tea with lemon, adjusted the antique brooch around her neck, and walked leisurely toward the rectory. Eliza was still there, now paler, more distant, but also strangely calm. Sitting by the window, she murmured to herself, although Miss Marple noticed that she was no longer talking to anyone invisible. She was talking to herself, as if she were finally waking up. "Hello, dear," Jane said gently. "Do you remember the lily among the rose bushes?" Eliza looked at her with disoriented eyes. It was her favourite. "Flower?" she replied in a fragile voice. "I know, but not because of beauty, right? It was because of something else. Something I shared with you, even though you never knew it." Eliza didn't reply, but a trembling of her lower lip told Jane that the truth was beginning to sink in. "Your mother left you more than a flower, my dear. She left you a name, a story, and someone was afraid you'd take it back." Miss Marple stood up and went straight to the temporary police station Inspector Hanley had set up in the old post office. He had just arrived from Westbridge and was leafing through a file with the expression of a man who detests loose ends. "Miss Marple," he said tersely, "are you trying to convince me once again that the young maid isn't our culprit?" "No, Inspector. I'm here to suggest you don't arrest him yet. I'm about to offer you a unique opportunity to see a murderer unmask himself, but I'll need your cooperation and your tea room. My tea room. Mrs. Dodd's. It's the most popular. And this afternoon I plan to invite 3 people. Peter Glanville, Nathaniel Everstone, and Clara Finch." Hanley frowned. "And the purpose? Observe, listen, and wait." At 5 o'clock sharp, Miss Marple was sitting at one of the round tables in the cosy tea-room. The establishment smelled of cinnamon buns and fermented secrets. Mrs. Dodd, although somewhat bewildered, served the tea with the dignity expected of someone serving unwitting conspirators. Peter arrived first, nervously wiping his hands with his handkerchief. Then Nathaniel, who tried to hide his discomfort behind a facade of indifference. Clara Finch was last. She entered like someone attending a play in which she knew she was the star. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began. "I know the last few days have been difficult, but I've put together a few pieces that, taken together, might shed some light on what happened that morning." Everyone fell silent. Jane took the portrait of Judith and Eliza out of her bag. She placed it on the table. "Judith Turner," he said, his voice calm. "The woman Lavinia Everstone made disappear from the town's history, but she didn't quite succeed. Eliza is her daughter, and someone at this table knew it. A faint, barely perceptible movement ran through Clara Finch's body. Jane noticed it. I knew it," he continued, "because he received Judith's last letter, a letter that spoke of a reunion at dawn. That letter was supposed to reach Lavinia, but it didn't. It was intercepted." Nathaniel shook his head. "I had nothing to do with it." "I believe it," Jane said, looking at him sympathetically, "because you didn't know Eliza existed. But someone did, and that someone was afraid Judith would come back and tell the truth." Everyone's eyes turned to Clara. She said nothing, but her hand trembled as she lifted the cup. Miss Marple delivered the final blow with the sweetness of a storyteller. Lavinia Everstone greeted Eliza without knowing who she was, but she soon sensed it. Perhaps from her eyes, perhaps from the whispers, and she wanted to reject her, as she had Judith. But she didn't have time, because someone had spoken first. Someone who feared the truth would destroy the image she had long protected. Someone who had been present and near the kitchen knife. Clara Finch put the cup down on the saucer with a small claptree. "I always knew Judith would come back," she said in a faint voice, "but I didn't know she'd left something so fragile." "Not fragile," Miss Marple corrected with a smile. "Persistent." Clara stood up. She didn't run away. She just wilted step by step, like a flower that knew winter had finally arrived. Inspector Hanley, listening from a nearby table, stood silently, and Miss Marple, as she watched Clara being led away, closed her eyes. The test had worked, because sometimes a killer doesn't need to be caught. He just needs to talk long enough to be convicted. Chapter 9. The Mirror Pieces. The silence in Little Davington after Clara Finch's arrest wasn't one of relief, but of restraint. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting to find out if what had been revealed was truly all that lay beneath the surface. But Miss Marple knew it wasn't. Clara's confession wasn't a complete confession. It was merely a crack in a mask, carefully woven over years. A useful crack, yes, but still insufficient. And deep down, Jane knew something that few in the village would dare admit. Clara hadn't stabbed Lavinia. The woman was many things: proud, vengeful, quietly cruel, but not strong, not impulsive, not like that. Clara had hidden cards, manipulated, perhaps even misled others, but she hadn't wielded the knife. That required a different kind of desperation, and another kind of love. That night, as the village murmured around the lampposts and closed windows, Miss Marple asked to see Eliza one more time, not at the rectory, but in her own home. "I want you to be comfortable," he said, offering her a cup of warm milk. "We're not going to talk about what everyone thinks. We're going to talk about what hasn't been said yet." Eliza, who seemed calmer, although still burdened with a silent sadness, held the cup in her hands without drinking. "Whose letter was that?" Jane asked softly. "From my mother," Eliza whispered. "The last one. The one I was going to give to Lavinia. I wanted her to know I was coming, that I wasn't seeking revenge, just the truth. But someone else read it before Lavinia." "Clara?" Eliza shook her head slowly. "No, it was Peter." Jane said nothing. She let the revelation float, take root. "He found it among my things," the young woman continued. "He didn't tell me, but I know. I saw it in the way he looked at me from then on, as if he knew something I didn't." "And you think it was him?" Eliza pressed her lips together. "I think he wanted to protect me, at all costs." Miss Marple nodded slowly, not in surprise, but in resignation. The next morning Jane walked to the greenhouse once more. Peter Glanville was there, as always, tending the lilies. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he said without turning around. "Too beautiful for this time of year," she replied. Peter gave a small laugh. "You already know that, right?" "I suspect. But I'd like to hear it from you." Peter turned around. His face was calm, but his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "I saw the letter. I read the name. Judith, and I knew immediately who Eliza was. My niece, my sister's blood. When Lavinia hired her, I thought it was a sign that things could be right, but Lavinia recognized her too, not by name, by eyes, by voice. She began to change, to watch her, to ask questions. Was he going to fire her? I was going to report her. She said Eliza shouldn't be in town, that she would bring shame, that Judith had been a stain, and that her daughter would be another. She told me the night before breakfast. She looked me in the eyes and said, 'Can still correct this mistake.' Miss Marple did not speak. 'I went ahead,' Peter said. 'It was quick. Lavinia was alone. She'd gone out to pick up a dropped napkin, and I followed her. I saw the knife. I didn't think. I only felt Judith, Eliza, my mother, everyone Lavinia had made suffer. And I saw myself, again, helpless. But this time you did something.' Peter nodded without pride. And then, when Eliza showed up, I didn't think the scene would turn out like this, that she would look like the culprit. I wanted to intervene, but the people had already spoken. And then Clara, Miss Marple added, Clara, who intercepted the letter, perhaps before you, Clara, who covered for you without knowing it. She thought she was the only one in danger." Peter gave a bitter laugh. "No one understands a withered flower like another withered flower." Jane placed her hand gently on her cane. "You'll go to the inspector. You'll tell him the truth, not because I asked you to, but because Eliza needs it, because she deserves a life that doesn't begin with a lie." Peter lowered his head. "I will do that," and as she walked away, Miss Marple stopped by the workbench. There, among the tools, was still a white petal, one that shouldn't have been there, one that said it all. The crime was born out of loyalty, but like many flowers, it had bloomed in silence. Chapter 10. A Truth That Is Not Announced. The day Peter Glanville confessed was grey, but not rainy, the kind of weather that seemed to understand that the town needed respite, not punishment. Inspector Hanley, upon hearing the statement, showed no triumph, only exhaustion. A kind of exhaustion reserved for those who know that justice rarely comes without flaws. "Are you sure what you're saying?" asked the inspector, after Peter's story, identical to the one Miss Marple had heard in the greenhouse. "Yes," the gardener replied firmly. "I don't want Eliza to bear the burden of what I did, nor do I want Judith's memory to be buried again under the shame of others." Hanley didn't reply immediately. He closed his notebook, put his pen in his pocket, and ordered a cup of tea. It took him almost half a cup before he said, "I'll be back." Miss Marple, of course, already knew. Jane, who was sitting in the corner of the room with the serenity of someone who had already solved several crimes before breakfast, barely nodded. "I suspected it," she said, "but I needed him to know it too." "And now?" Hanley asked. "What does duty do when the heart demands silence?" Miss Marple looked at him, not with authority, but with wisdom. "You do what you must, Inspector, but with delicacy. Some truths don't need to be shouted from the rooftops. They just need to be written in the margins of reports, where decent people can find them. If they dare to look, the people knew, as people know everything, without the need for official word." Peter was escorted out of the town without handcuffs, without any disturbance. They said he would confess before a judge in Westbridge, that he would surrender without resistance. Eliza was released the next day, without ceremony, without apology. The eyes with which she was viewed had changed, some with pity, others with distance, and a few with respect. But nothing would ever be the same. Miss Marple welcomed her into her garden that afternoon. She offered her a chair and a slice of apple pie, as if they were old acquaintances. "Thank you," Eliza said, "for believing in me." "It wasn't a question of believing, my dear. It was a question of observing. You were talking to yourself. Yes, but no one stops to think about who a girl who has lost so much might be talking to." Eliza looked down. "Sometimes I heard her. My mother. Not really, but in the wind, in the sounds of the morning, as if she were telling me I wasn't alone." "I wasn't," Jane stated softly. There was a silence, a comfortable one. "What will you do now?" "I don't know," Eliza replied. "Maybe I'll stay, or maybe I'll go to London." Judith always spoke of London as a place where no one asks you where you're from. It's also a place where it's easy to get lost. But if you carry the right souvenir, you won't get lost completely. Eliza smiled for the first time without sadness. "And you, Miss Marple, what do you do after solving a murder?" Jane sipped her tea. "Ah, dear, I'll put some jam on the boil. Nothing restores balance like something sweet that takes a while to simmer." That night, as little Davington slowly returned to its usual whisper, to the sound of china cups, footsteps on wet stone, and pages turned at dusk, the truth hung in the air like a lingering perfume. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a true ending. And at Miss Marple's window, a new flower was blooming. A white lily, grown out of season, like a discreet symbol of things that endure. Because some stories don't end with a trial, but with a flower that refuses to wither. Chapter 11. The Echo of Silent Things. Little Davington didn't exactly return to normal. What had happened wasn't a simple incident that could be swept under the carpets of fresh flowers and morning scones. It was a wound, soft but lasting, like the edge of a blade that has cut without breaking. However, like any small town, its people began to do what they did best. Adapt. The bank reopened at 9 o'clock. The Thursday market, with its vegetables arranged in wooden crates, looked as orderly as before. The library resumed its reverent silence. But if one looked closely, one noticed the differences. A lower tone in conversations. A gaze held a second. Too long. A slightly firmer handshake. Mrs. Dodd, from her tea shop, had a new custom, placing a small white lily next to the cash register. She didn't say why. No one dared ask. At church, Reverend Mullins struggled to deliver sermons that spoke of redemption without directly naming what had happened, but the words carried more weight now, and some of his parishioners emerged with moist eyes, as if they had understood something previously foreign to them. Mrs. Clara Finch was never seen again. Some said she had gone to live with a cousin, Torquay. Others that she simply decided not to go out any more. But all agreed that the solitude she had cultivated for years had ended up silently devouring her. Miss Marple didn't speak harshly to her when the subject came up. She just said in a soft voice, "Sometimes the worst punishment is living with what you didn't say." Eliza, for her part, spent a few weeks in the village boarding house, cared for partly by Mrs. Bramble, and partly by the desire of many to redeem themselves without speaking openly about it. She helped in the library, strolled discreetly through the woods, and occasionally spent afternoons with Miss Marple. "I'm not sure if I should stay," she confessed one afternoon, while helping to pick mint leaves in Jane's garden. "There's no need to decide now," said Miss Marple. "Some roots take time to know whether they will sprout or whether they must seek other soil." "Do you think my mother loved me?" "Oh, definitely," she said with conviction. The way she wrote that last letter, the tone, she didn't speak from fear, but from love, from a desire to be heard, even if it was just one last time. "And do you think he ever thought about coming back?" Mothers don't go away completely, dear. Sometimes they're in the silences, or in the way you tilt your head, or in the memories you don't even know are your own. You brought her back, not just by coming, by resisting to stay. Eliza closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The scent of mint was fresh, clean, like a new page yet to be written. A week later, Peter Glanville was sentenced for involuntary manslaughter. The judge, informed of the voluntary confession, the years of silence, and the accumulated pain, handed down a light sentence. Prison, yes, but with conditions that would allow him to reintegrate within a few years. The town greeted him with a mixture of understanding and sadness. Miss Marple didn't go to the trial, not because she wasn't interested, but because she understood that some closings don't require witnesses. Instead, that morning she made jam, with more sugar than usual, and so the days slowly unravelled like a patiently woven scarf. Life returned, but not identical. Perhaps more attentive, perhaps more cautious. One morning, Eliza passed by Miss Marple's garden for the last time. She was carrying a small carry-on suitcase. "I'm going to try my luck in London," he said firmly, although his eyes were trembling a little. "You have my blessing," Jane said. "But remember, the truth isn't always in what we leave behind, but in how we carry it with us." Eliza nodded. She bowed and, without saying a word, placed a small bouquet of lilies on the tea table. As he walked away down the path, the air seemed different, not lighter, but more sincere. And Miss Marple, sitting under the pergola, watched as the young girl disappeared into the flowering hedges, as if the story were freeing her from herself. The echo of silent things still floated in the air, and sometimes that was the truest sound of all. Chapter 12. The Flowers That Grow from Silence. Miss Marple always said that crime, like a garden, had its seasons. It couldn't be planted without roots. It didn't bloom without a reason. And it never truly died. In Little Davington, spring had brought more than daffodils and reunions. It had brought a long-buried truth, and a wound that, though healed, still ached to the touch. A week after Eliza's departure, Jane sat in her favourite corner of the garden, where the flowers grew in quiet obedience. Beside her was a new notebook. The old one had been filled with notes, observations, and fragments of conversation that, patiently strung together, had led to the outcome. This new notebook was still blank. He liked that symbol, the beginning after a story. There was no rush to fill it. As I knitted, I remembered the pieces as if they were threads, the diverted letter, the first hint of a hidden truth, the one who diverted. It wasn't Clara, as many assumed, but Peter. But Clara read it too, and she feared, not for Eliza, but for the possibility that Lavinia would destroy everything again. Her silence was complicity, the kitchen knife. Taken from the new game Lavinia had bought, it was a symbol more than a weapon. It represented order, domestic perfection, and the ultimate disruption of that same order, the lily on the rosebush of flower out of place. An impossible natural error, and therefore a perfect clue. The lily was Judith's flower, and Judith was the link everyone wanted to forget. Peter Glanville, the silent gardener, the silent witness to the shame of others. His act wasn't one of hatred, but of desperate protection. There was no planning in his hands, only impulse. But even defence is born of fear. Eliza, the seed that Lavinia wanted to deny. It wasn't enough to banish Judith. Her memory had returned with its own voice, and even when the town was about to repeat its mistake, this time there were eyes that knew how to see differently. And above all, the reaction of the people, not with torches or mobs, but with whispers, evasions, and condemnations disguised as kindness. Sometimes, Jane thought, the cruelest form of violence is social, and the most invisible is that which is carried out without words. A few days later, Inspector Hanley returned to Little Davington. This time not to investigate, but to have tea. He sat with Miss Marple under the pergola, holding a small bouquet of flowers wrapped in newspaper. "I'm not sure the system understands things like this," he said after a few sips. "A crime without a clear villain. A punishment that doesn't quite fit the norm." "Perhaps because not all crimes are created equal," Jane replied. "Some are born of greed, others of fear, and a few of memory. As if the past, if left unspoken, will eventually scream. Do you think Peter deserved to leave? I think I needed to do it, not to run away, but to clear the ground where new things will grow." Hanley nodded, placing the bouquet on the table. "They were lilies, white, fresh. One of my agents told me you should have been an inspector." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, no. The police solve crimes. I just watch people, and people, Inspector. They never cease to be interesting." That night, as the breeze stirred the white curtains at her window, Miss Marple wrote the last lines on the back of her previous notebook. The truth doesn't always break out. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes she walks barefoot on the wet grass. Sometimes it blooms when no one expects it. But it always, always leaves a trace. You just have to stop and listen to it. He closed the notebook. A cup of tea was poured, and he let the silence return, not as a threat, but as company, because in the heart of small towns, and in the heart of true crimes, the answer isn't in the evidence. It's in the things left unsaid. And no one listened to the silence like Miss Marple.